Bon matin et merci d'être ici avec nous aujourd'hui. Je suis Tyler McCann, directeur général de l'Institut canadien des politiques agroalimentaires. Avant de commencer la discussion ce matin, j'aimerais reconnaître que je vous joins d'Ottawa, le territoire traditionnel et non cédé de la nation algonquin-anishinaabe. N'importe où que nous sommes, nous devrions tous reconnaître et réfléchir aux peuples autochtones qui ont été les premiers inhabitants de nos terres. And today, on World Water Day, it is important to reflect on water and the important role it plays with First Nations, the challenges that First Nations communities have from coast to coast, and the important efforts that need to continue to be made on our path to reconciliation. We are excited to be hosting the webinar today based on work completed by CAPI Distinguished Fellow Nicolas Mesley. In 2021, CAPI launched our Distinguished Fellowship Program in an effort to focus our research in the areas of environment sustainability, innovation, and animal health, trade, and water. Since then, our fellows have been completing vital work. Among them, Nicolas Mesley has been focusing his research on a vital resource, water. Today's webinar is based on Nicolas' recently published research on water in Canadian agriculture. The work discusses the importance of water from a national and regional perspective, including the governance and geo-implications of water management. It is especially powerful that we are hosting this webinar today, World Water Day, a day where we can all spend time reflecting on not just the necessity of water, but on the threats global water supplies face and the opportunities for Canada. We want to extend a special thank you for the support of the RBC Foundation. This research work is supported in part by the RBC Foundation's Tech For Nature initiative and is part of CAPI's larger environmental initiative, Spearheading Sustainable Solutions. CAPI cannot deliver on its mission on its own. We rely on knowledge and financial partners to make our work possible. Please reach out to Bree, our Director of Partnerships and Business Development, to talk about becoming a CAPI partner. This morning, we'll begin the webinar by hearing from our distinguished fellow, Nicolas Mesley, who will set the stage and provide an overview of his research. We'll then turn to a larger panel discussion where I will ask them a question one by one, followed by an open discussion where you will have the opportunity to ask questions. Please use the Q&A function on your screens to submit questions. Nicolas Mesley is an agronomist, reporter, and photographer specializing in agri-food and ecological issues. He started his career at Le Bulletin des Agricultures magazine and has held senior positions within the Government of Canada. His extensive experience studying agriculture in Canada, the United States, and globally has provided invaluable insights as CAPI examines the emerging challenges and opportunities of Canadian agri-food production, and we are pleased to count Nicolas as one of our distinguished fellows. Over to you. Merci.
OK. Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Well, thank you, Tyler, and hello, everyone, and welcome. Quick note to say that I'm very grateful to CIPA for this fellowship. Look, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has just released its 6th assessment report on Monday this week. And wherever you look, the planet is cooking and is confronted with extreme weather. So I'm personally convinced that the quantity and the quality of water will redefine the national and international agriculture and trade and production on the planet. I'm also convinced that Canada, being the second largest country in the world and having 20% of the freshwater reserves, could play and should play a key role to feed the world and to ensure its food security. This fellowship was awarded to me to explore the need for Canada to establish a national water policy. So this is the first presentation of 3, where today I will focus on Canada's largest province, Quebec. I will now switch in French, as I understand there's excellent English translator with us. So
we could say that Quebec's richness is its fresh water. That's called its blue gold. Quebec has less. Quebec is the largest province in the country and a small northern carton. It has a fertile land concentrated in the St. Lawrence Plain. The province has thousands of lakes. It has Hydro-Quebec, and it has some of the largest dams in the world. The province has 8 million inhabitants, and they are the biggest consumer of water in the world. The water in Quebec, just like in the rest of Canada, is owned by the collective. And now I'd like you to take a look at this map. Quebec may be the largest province in the country, but less than 5% of the territory is farmable. That represents 2.3 million hectares. And most of those lands are around the St. Lawrence River. Look at the green part, Montreal, Drummondville. And this is where we find the most fertile land. And 70% of their production is in that region. There is about 1,000 millimeters of rain every year. We can just go into the next slide. So now, let's talk about the economic sector. There's 27,500 agricultural businesses. There's a Council of Transformation Alimentaire du Québec that has 550 businesses, and it takes care of 70% of the agricultural production in Quebec. That represents 72,000 jobs, 100,000 indirect jobs, which means this is the leading manufacturing sector with $30 billion in sales in 2021. And when we go to the exports in Quebec, this is at $10 billion, which means this is 12% of Canadian exports. So when you're thinking about pork, maple syrup, blueberries, cranberries, Quebec is quite strong in agriculture. And now let's see what is the picture. So today, first of all, we're going to talk about the conflict of usage between agriculture and the industry and the environment and urbanization. We're going to take a look at the price of electricity. We're going to take a look at the water exports, a polluted border, and the conclusion. Next slide. So the producer that you see here on the screen, his name is Francis de Rocher, and he's the president of potato productions in Quebec. He has a production of $214 million. He has higher yield than the average Canadian producer because he manages water. He takes the water in 2 different rivers, and he invested $2 million in different hydration system in the last few years. So he's selling his produce to the big grocery, just like Loblaw or Metro or others. And in 2021, his region had droughts, and his farm is just next to a protected area, the Lanaudière protected area, and many producers take the water out of the rivers that feed that natural reserve. A lot of producers do many productions, may that be strawberries, cranberries. So this man thought, well, with the drought, who will have priority on whom to get the water, especially if the water is needed for the ecological reserve? So after the government made some studies of underground water, and the producers are using more than 75,000 liters of water a day, but they don't know if those permits would be renewed. So there are 2 things here. So drought raises the tension between producers and the government. And in 2021, one of his neighbors actually took water in his own reserve. And the second thing is that the ecological reserve is owned by several municipalities that also need their water. So this is the first real conflict for water in the province of Quebec between producers, municipalities, and one of the solutions would be to build a pipeline from the St. Lawrence into that region. But the question is, who would pay for that kind of infrastructure? So when we take a look at the next slide, the man that you see here, his name is Jean-Bernard van Winden. The Van Winden family is Dutch origin. They're the first one who had those black lands at south of Montreal. And we call that region the Small California. And here it's not a drought problem, but it's a water problem. In 2022, he could not produce lettuce because there was too much water. So in Quebec, when you see insurance companies and claims for all kinds of natural reasons have tripled in the last few years. And in 2020, it went up to $70 million a year. So the first myth in Quebec is that, yeah, there's a lot of water. However, it doesn't fall at the right place at the right time because of extreme moments. And this is all provoked by climate change. Then there's a second myth. Jean-Bernard van Winden is co-owner of the 4 farms that feed Vecpo International. That is the biggest export of fresh lettuce in Canada, with a business of $270 million. And in last June, an American investment fund called Winden Partners that became a main shareholder. So the co-owner that is a minority in the business told me that the availability of the water and its quality is part of the favorable factors of the transaction. However, when we take a look at those producers like Winden, well, they take all of their water in an underground in the region. And according to researchers, underwater water is overexploited. It is overexploited, first of all, by industries at 51%, and then by industrial factor into 32%, and the last one, agriculture, with 17%. So this is the second myth. World Bank says that agriculture using 70% of fresh water in most part of the world, but we have to be careful with this statistic because it varies a lot from one place to another. So one of the questions we're wondering is that Quebec is very far from the California situation, but we have to ask ourselves the question, is a good water management in Quebec could bring American investors? Next slide. Now, the woman you see on the screen is Isabel Sharon from AG Co. She published 2 research on climate change for the Ministry of the Environment. Sorry, for the Agricultural Ministry of Quebec. What she told me is that water is a taboo topic for producers. They are afraid of either not having enough water or to have some restrictions. And yes, there is a need for infrastructure that is not numbered, but there is a need for training producers. And we must also focus on technology. And when we take a look at the investments in Quebec are not only in agricultural producers, but also greater producers that have their own irrigation system. And this is more like an insurance rather than in spending. And what Madame Sharon said is that we need to change the culture, the perception from the population. Why? Because the fact that there is urban sprawl and an increase of the population that drains a lot of water, because people, urbanization is the priority before any other activity, activity. And we have a societal debate here on the price of water. The price of water is important in every part of the economy, and the territory is divided in 40, and they should all manage their own water. But there is no regulating power between different stakeholders. So basically, there's no way to solve some of the issues. So now let me describe a little bit what is going on in Quebec. Well, the current government with the Premier François Legault, well, he wants to build new dams. He wants to double the capacity of Hydro-Quebec. We will use this electricity to power electric vehicles, lower carbon emissions, and export to the United States. So there are great debates and consultations this autumn to debate the future of Hydro-Quebec. There are some prices for electricity at the domestic level and industrial level. So electricity pricing. When we talk about entrepreneurs and transformers, producers, well, how can I say? You see some that people are worried. The man that you see on the right is Mr. Jean Gattuso. He's the former CEO of La Somme Industry, who is a Canadian leader in North American in the producer of vegetables and fruits. He is at the stock market in Toronto. He has 18 factories in Canada and the United States, and his business is $1.9 billion in 2021. And in an interview, what he said, who is in one of the founding members of the agro-producing in Quebec, well, he said that if we are not careful at the price of water and electricity, the Canadian agricultural sector will have competitivity sector. Some companies in Quebec had special pricing for electricity prices lower than the inflation. So in 2019, the local government wanted to adjust these pricing to inflation. And then, well, there were lobbies that were against it, and there were two representatives of the lobbies, one Olimel and others, who went in front of a parliamentary committee to say that special pricing will hurt their investment. Olimel is the largest pork exporter in the country, and its representative said that they thought about establishing somewhere else in Canada if they didn't have professional pricing, and they already have other locations in Alberta. So although there was a warning, the Quebec government went forward with it, but it had to get back because the inflation was now at 6.3% in 2022. So that is why it was important. It's important to have this debate to know what to do with the small, middle, and larger producers. And during those consultations, well, there is going to be consultations in the fall. And another picture here, the Quebec government went full steam ahead to develop greenhouse production on fruits and vegetables. And that is done with subsidized electricity. Next picture. Why am I telling you about water export in the United States? Well, when I was doing research, I did some interviews with different producers, different association with different experts, but by analyzing what is happening on the field, well, that topic came up more often than not. So what's the picture? Well, with climate change, can we have massive water export to the US? The project, well, there were two large projects. In the 1960s, one American one, which is called the North American Power. who would bring water from Alaska by going through Alberta and Saskatchewan in order to bring it to the Great Lakes and then to California. The other project, Canadian origin this time, it was called the Grand Canal, and it would have taken the water from the Beijings to put it in the Great Lakes by going through Quebec and Ontario to distribute it in the west part of the country. But these two projects, well, it was going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars, and they were dead. So the question is, would those kind of projects, would an Elon Musk kind of businessman, could he do it? Would it be possible today? Well, what the expert you see on the screen, Mr. Frédéric Lassalle, said that it's not possible. Why? Because there's the new NAFTA, and they're still wondering if water is a commodity. Water in a drink or as a water is sold as a commodity. However, for exports, well, it's not clear in the treaty. What is reassuring, though, so that environmental regulation is so high that that would be very difficult to do. The legal argument here behind this, in the Great Lake Agreement, if you take water, then you must return the same volume as you've taken out. So it means that you need to do water treatment, and the bar is really, really high at the environmental level for whatever project. So that is what I was told by Frédéric Lassalle, who's an expert. So now I'm going to bring you to the next slide. A polluted border. You have to know that Quebec is the largest dairy and pork producer in Canada. And agriculture has changed in the last 20, 30 years. Now we do a lot of corn and soy. And a lot of it is also provided to feed animals. So the 2/3 of pollutants that we find in the water in Quebec is from farming. It's a pollution caused by agriculture, and there is an agreement in Quebec, Vermont, to remove the pollution from the Bay Missisquoi. This is a touristic zone that is quite famous, and in 2021, the objectives to phosphorate in the water was never achieved. So when we take a look at the help to the producers, in order to have better practices, well, there's two things. There's the Sustainable Agricultural Program, the MAPAC, and the Federal Provincial Agreement on Watershed Agriculture. And what I was told is that on the American side, they have a lot of more help, financial help to the producers, and the Clean Water Act in the United States, it's much tougher than what we find here in Canada. And now, I don't want to judge here, but the producer that you see here, his name is Paul Caplet, and he's a top-notch of great culture production in Quebec. He's really taking care of the environment. He has a culture rotation. He has introduced corn, and he's managing his farm very, very well, and he's always very, very careful. So that's why he was on the first page, the front page rather, of a magazine that I was publishing. So the conclusion now. My conclusion is the following. It's the paradox of water and diamond. What Adam Smith said, I don't know if you know him, but he said that water is vital. It has almost no market value, but a diamond is worth billions of dollars more. When we take a look at climate change, when we're taking a look at what is going on around the world, is it smart that the price of water would not be higher than it is now. In Quebec, the price of water and electricity should be part of a societal debate. For instance, you have different organizations, just like OSACOR. They say that the money paid by water bottlers in Quebec are way too low. So the price of water should rise. And one of the conclusions is that different producers need infrastructure, training, and technologies on water management. And it's the same thing for every other sector. We should develop this at Laval University, at McGill University. Researchers should work on this. And one of the things we can tell ourselves is that all of the efforts from producers and transformers in order to better water management, well, it's worthless, it's useless if there's no effort by citizens. That is why we have to work a lot on it. We think we have a lot of water. However, it depends where it falls, right? So producers are at the forefront of all of this. They have to be careful. At the same time, if you, on your side, you spread water on your asphalt because it's too warm, well, you have to think about what you're doing. And the last thing is, we see that in Alberta, for instance, there is a water district and it's water is administered. In Quebec, you don't find that. So in Quebec, different regions should have more regulatory power. So this is the end of my presentation. And now I would like to thank the ICPA team, Tyler Messon, Al Muscle, and Jill Poirier. And if you have questions later on, well, please do not hesitate to ask me some questions. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nicholas.
Comme vous avez dit, as Nicolas mentioned, as Nicolas mentioned, if you have questions after, please use the Q&A function of the chat, and we look forward to that dialogue starting later. We'll now move to the panel portion of the discussion. Our first panelist is Dr. Osman Sedu. He is an associate professor and director of the hydraulics lab at the University of Ottawa. He holds a PhD in water resources. And his research is focused on developing hydrological models, which can then be used in climate change strategies. He is an active international collaborator, and Dr. Sedu has completed work in Canada, Ghana, the United States, and a number of other countries. So my question to start the discussion today with you is that, you know, when you look at your work as a professor at the Faculty of Engineering, you know, your work has looked at the water use and hydrological management with a focus on these changing impacts and the impact of climate change. You've looked at water use and availability in Canada and around the world, and you've done some work with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and are really exploring this water, energy, environment, food nexus, and have done some interesting work in the Niger Basin. Can you start our panel discussion today offering your thoughts around that, what that future of the water, energy, environment, food nexus in Canada and around the world looks like, and what you think needs to change, or how you see it playing out, and what do we know and what do we not know about the future of that nexus and water management itself?
Thanks, Tyler, for the question, and thanks for inviting me. So the Nexus is a holistic approach to resource management. So the previous presenter has done a good job showing the concern of the agricultural, of farmers about water availability. They are afraid of being short of water. which is surprising in Canada because you have plenty of water. And he also mentioned that he witnessed the first conflict between water use for agriculture and environmental flow, and he was surprised. So water is important to these people, but ecosystems are important to us too. So these are two objectives we're trying to simultaneously get, and we are in crisis for both of them. So the Nexus is one way of thinking where we try to have the global picture, and we try to look at the interconnection between the objectives. So typically it's water, food security, energy security, environmental sustainability, but you can add more sectors. And we have to be aware we are in a very complex world where everything is interconnected. So trying to get more food means that you might destroy the environment. Trying to get more energy. So we need to stop thinking in silo, and whatever we're doing, we need to try to understand what's going to happen. So I do something in one sector, but I'm going to have impact in other sector, and I need to be aware of it. And to make things more complicated, the science is not at the point we can predict what happens. The world is too complex for what we know. So you have to be aware you might affect other sector, but you have to be aware you might not know what's going to happen, and you have to be very careful. So is it important in Canada? Yes, the previous presenter has mentioned the first conflict, and there are going to be more conflict in the future. Of course, when there is scarcity, like in Africa, then it's going to be more obvious. But even here in Canada, we need to think everywhere. We need to think in a holistic manner. It may be our only path to sustainability. What needs to change? We need to change the culture of how you do infrastructure. So typically, at least in the country they work in, the energy ministry will not talk to the water ministry, will not talk to the agricultural ministry, and they do their project in their sector, and they get surprised because their project is going to limit other investment. And at the end, we have limited resources, and we're investing resources which are canceling each other, which is not a good idea. So I think I covered all your question. I don't know if I missed something.
Yeah, I think, you touched on an interesting point about needing to talk and work together and to bridge that gap. I guess my first question is, do we do a better job of that in Canada from your experience? And my second question would be, how much of that challenge is driven by, your earlier comment about we don't know the lack of science, the lack of understanding of what those impacts are?
So are we doing a better job? I think yes, in Canada, projects are dealt with in a multidisciplinary manner, but we all know that in the administration there are conflicts of competence. One example is the hydrological monitoring network. You have the federal network, you have the Quebec network. So we are maybe better off than other countries, but there's still work to do. And about the science, it's really, we have to recognize that there's a lot we don't know, especially in environmental impacts. And yet we need to take decisions. So whenever you get a report with number, you have to be careful. These numbers are based on the best science, but that science is not perfect. So when implementing the changes, you have to take an adaptive approach. So the science said you should do this, do it for a couple of years. If it works the way you want, okay. If not, then go back to the science and try something else.
And that's, does that window to try things though get shorter as the impacts of climate change and water scarcity increase, or is it are we left with few other options because of our need to the limitations around what we know and what we don't?
No, the window is not related. The window, it depends on what you're looking at, right? If you're looking at, say, ecosystem reproduction, which takes years, then the window is longer. But the fact that we are in crisis with respect to climate is just bring up the urgency to act. So we need to start doing something now. But the windows is just adaptive management. So we try a solution, we monitor, we learn from it, and then we restart.
Great, thank you. And so I go down to our second panelist to pick up some of these themes. Our second panelist this morning is Nicola Crowhall. Last June, Nicola joined the Canadian Water Network as their CEO. Prior to that, she worked for over 25 years and led and shaped water governance in Canada. Nicola has served as the Deputy Director of the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative and as a Senior Advisor with the Provincial Government of Ontario, where she oversaw the introduction of the Clean Water Act. Nicola, thank you for joining us this morning. And I want to pick up on those questions around water management. Osman talked about the conflicts that exist, some of the silos that are there. You know, I think if you look at around water management and water strategy in Canada, your past working at different levels of government and in different parts of the country. How do you think Canada does when it comes to water management and strategy, particularly kind of this more global view outside of agriculture? You know, how has that changed over the last 20 years as pressures have increased? And we're waiting for an announcement any day now about the Canadian Water Agency. Can you talk about how you think that will play into this broader question about water management and strategy in Canada?
Sure, thanks, Tyler. Let's start with water quantity. As I think Nicola pointed out, Canada has an embarrassment of riches when it comes to sources of fresh water. And water is provided at a very low cost to households and businesses, which is good for affordability, but means that there's an incentive to overconsume. And as a result, Canadians are water hogs. Collectively, we consume the equivalent of about 60,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools of water per day. Per capita, we are only second to the United States in the world in water consumption. You know, by comparison, Europeans only consume about half as much of water. We consume a lot of water. We're not feeling the effects of that because we have a lot of water to consume. But that also means that Canada is far behind in terms of things like water reuse, of using water efficiently, given the lack of, you know, a cost driver or a regulatory driver. We treat water also to a very high standard. So literally the water that is possible to drink is also used to clean streets. Why? Why don't we apply a fit for purpose lens to say we're not going to spend that much money on treating water that doesn't have a potable use? But we don't even have any regulatory or legislative framework to allow for that kind of water reuse. It's just starting. In terms of drinking water quality, I would say municipal utilities do a very good job of ensuring that public drinking water is safe, particularly since the Walkerton drinking water crisis in 2000. There was a wholesale re-examination of drinking water safety, and important checks and balances were put in place. For example, in Ontario, plans are developed in each watershed to protect sources of public drinking water. There is a big exception. Water quality on Indigenous reserves is, as I think most Canadians know, in a very poor shape in many places. That's a federal responsibility, and they are trying to address these persistent drinking water problems. Let's talk about the management of water more generally, including the health of watersheds, the protection of features that help the hydrologic cycle, like marshlands, grasslands, forests, tree stands. This is the responsibility of provinces. And it's always been a poor cousin to, say, the delivery of drinking water or the collection of wastewater. There simply isn't enough attention paid to the value of, say, what we call natural infrastructure. And it often just gets paved over for development. Nicolas talked about that pressure even on agricultural land. In the context of climate change, this is not a good strategy. We need to preserve those natural features. They're essential to contribute to retaining water. You'd ask in terms of, where do I see all this going? I would see there are three interrelated imperatives. First, we need to reduce our carbon footprint. Second, we need to reduce the amount of waste we generate. People call it moving to a circular economy. And third, we have to face the fact that the future is going to be hotter and drier with these intermittent, very intense rain or wet weather events. So this requires us to build more adaptive and resilient communities. So what could that look like in practice? And I'm seeing it as I go, around to different countries. I just came back from the Netherlands, and they're doing amazing things because basically they have water everywhere and they have to control it, and they've had water boards in place for about 700 years. So some of the things that could be done would be to combine manure and sewage and compostable organics all into enormous digesters and create green methane that could be put into the pipelines. It could mean installing phosphorus removal technologies to capture and recycle nutrients from agricultural runoff. It could mean recirculating the heat in hot water consumed in households or industrial processes through heat transfer technology. It could mean radically rethinking water reuse along the lines that I already talked about to maximize, reuse by applying a fit for purpose lens to treatment. Or it could mean being more vigilant in identifying important natural features and protecting them to retain moisture and water in our ecosystem. All of this is possible right now. We have all the technologies to do everything I just outlined, but we're not doing it. So it's a question of raising awareness and finding the drivers, the right price point to make it economical to make these changes. I'll just make one last comment, which is around your question around the Canada Water Agency. I do see it playing a really important role. I don't see the federal government should give it authority to be able to impose anything on provinces. Water management is regulated at the provincial level, and it should be because they know better what their water needs are. But what we need is a national dialogue, and a national dialogue that will lead to a national direction. And I think that's what CAPI is talking about, is a national water policy. And that would mean bringing together water irrigation districts, water allocation agencies, big water users in the economy, First Nations and Indigenous water rights holders, municipalities, all talking about these. We may not have the conflicts yet, but we're going to have them eventually with climate change. So be prepared. Get the information together about what we can anticipate from climate, even a geospatial view of that, of where we think we're going to see the impacts hit us hardest, and start that dialogue, start those relationships to be able to manage those conflicts in advance and to avoid them, and to build the resiliency we'll need.
And certainly, if you think about some of the pieces that you just talked about, this future being hotter and drier, the potential for conflict, the need to protect our natural infrastructure, building out and increasing water reuse, agriculture really plays an important role, or agriculture and food production, I would imagine, should play a large role in that discussion. Can you speak to how you see agriculture fitting into that broader national dialogue that you think needs to take place?
Sure. I mean, as well as anybody, that agriculture is central to Canada's economy. It's a vital part of Canada's economy. And as Nicolas pointed out, it's also a vital part of the global food supply. So it has to be supported, it has to be protected. Agriculture can contribute and gain, in my opinion, from all three trends that I talked about: net zero carbon, circular economy, climate adaptation, and resiliency. Agriculture occupies a huge footprint, a huge geographic area in Canada. So it is both impacted by and will continue to be impacted by these changes that Nicolas talked about. At the very beginning of his presentation, he said he felt that climate change would reorganize and, the whole global food production and supply. Because those areas that can't grow food will no longer grow food, and those who have longer growing seasons like Canada will benefit. So in terms of water use, in terms of water quality, in terms of water sources, it's really existential for the agricultural sector to both be prepared and also to take measures to protect water resources. So I agree with CAPI. We need a national plan that supports agriculture and its water needs, promotes agricultural and watershed practices that support, what can be called a healthy hydroclimatic cycle. But it means acknowledging that something's going to change, and that we've got to work together to figure out what practices we've got to put in place.
Great. Thank you. And we'll pick that up in a minute and build on your comment about things changing, but also the potential impact and benefit with our next and final panelist this morning. Margot Jarvis-Redelbach is Executive Director of the Alberta Irrigation Districts Association. She's a registered professional agrologist. Margot has worked in various natural resources sectors. She worked at the Eastern Irrigation District for many years, where she had the pleasure of directly assisting producers with wildlife habitat initiatives, irrigation development projects, and on-farm efficiency conversion projects, while at the same time promoting the benefits of these activities to the general public. Margot, Nicolas just made the point about the role of this potential, this need to understand how things are changing, but really the opportunities for agriculture to be a driver and be a user. Certainly, irrigation and irrigation on the prairies is at the forefront of that thinking. And so I was wondering if we could start by talking about what is that impact that irrigation is having? How is that changing? And what, this change in awareness, that we've got this interesting piece in Alberta where your provincial agriculture department is now the provincial or the Ministry of Agriculture and Irrigation. So obviously there's this awareness there, but what do you think what does that future actually look like, and what impact do you think it has, and what does managing that resource sustainably mean in Alberta today as you look to growing the role of irrigation?
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. I am going to speak to our experience here in Alberta, particularly Southern Alberta. For the attendees out there who may not know a lot about irrigation, particularly in Alberta, the province holds greater than 2/3 of Canada's irrigation, with most of that irrigation being practiced within 12 irrigation districts located in Southern Alberta. Water delivery to about 600,000 hectares of irrigated land in those districts is primarily achieved through a gravity system that consists of about 8,000 kilometers of canals and pipelines and 52 storage reservoirs. Now, the large majority of that infrastructure is owned and operated by the irrigation districts. The source of the water that flows through that infrastructure is from our surface rivers, with the snowpack in our Rocky Mountains providing that valuable resource throughout the growing season. So the infrastructure really supports water supply and security, first and foremost to mitigate from drought, but also to mitigate from flood events. The system was really originally designed primarily to support irrigated agricultural production, and it still does to this day. Our irrigators are extremely fortunate to be able to choose from over 60 different crop types, as opposed to the growth of only about 30 on dry land parcels in Alberta. Of those 60, about half of the crop types are what are considered high value specialty crops. So they have a real ability to generate significant revenue for the producers who are growing them. Now, those high value specialty crops in particular really support a large agri-food processing industry in Alberta. Those industries are often located in rural areas, and they can get water supplied to them through the infrastructure for their day-to-day facility needs. But the bigger reason that they locate in Alberta is because of the reduced risk that comes from a consistent and high quality agricultural product that's grown under irrigation. Now, agriculture, the primary beneficiary of the irrigation network in Southern Alberta, but the system also supplies non-irrigation water supply to a number of users and uses. Other industries such as oil and gas can access water from the infrastructure, and several of our dams on our storage reservoirs have hydropower generation facilities on them as well. Extremely important in Southern Alberta is the fact that over 50 municipalities can access water from the infrastructure. Those municipalities are located some distance away from river sources of water. And of course, groundwater in our region is of generally poor quality and hard to find. Wetlands and wildlife habitat and fisheries habitat are very well developed because of the existence of the water moving across that region in Southern Alberta. And of course, the large reservoirs provide abundant recreation. So the latter two really provide intrinsic as well as mental health and physical health attributes to Alberta residents and tourists alike. I mentioned 600,000 hectares of irrigated land. That represents about 4.4% of Alberta's cultivated land base. It's not that much of a land base, but it does contribute about 27% of Alberta's total primary agricultural sales and 28% of the Alberta Agri-Food gross domestic product. It really does have a multiplier impact when you factor in not just agriculture, but all of the other benefits to municipalities, other industries, recreation, and wetlands and fisheries. Annually, the sector contributes about $5.4 billion to the provincial GDP, about $3.2 billion in labor income, and creates about 46,000 full-time equivalent positions across the province. The benefits of that GDP accrual, it's about 80% generation to the province, with only about 20% of that generation accruing to individual irrigation producers. So there is a fairly significant, community or societal benefit to the infrastructure being in place here in Southern Alberta. I guess how it will change, I think that irrigation is going to continue to grow, particularly here in Southern Alberta, and that's really because of those economic and societal benefits that it contributes. When we look at the GDP accrual in the 10-year period from 2011 to 2018, the previous period, 2000 to 2011, there was a 48% increase in the generation coming off of irrigation to the provincial GDP, which is really significant. And I think it speaks to the fact that irrigation and agriculture really provide through the value chain good paying jobs, and that's on farm, in agri-food processing, but also in supporting services like engineering firms and technology, as well as government jobs. I think we're going to see continued interest in for expansion in traditional irrigated regions, as well as outside of those areas. It is a significant investment to construct conveyance infrastructure and to make the on-farm investments to irrigate, but it really reduces the overall risk, particularly from drought. I think, this is really being driven by increasing global population and the food requirements from that increasing population, geopolitical conflict in other key growing regions, high commodity prices, and of course, just a general need to adapt to the changing climate and lower the risk of growing agricultural products. And, I'd say that Canadian producers are really heavily invested in sustainable agricultural practices, and many will start to really consider irrigation to complement their existing practices. And I guess, our trajectory is really quite good. We're increasing sustainability in the sector. Key to that is creating and encouraging activities that support water conservation, efficiency, and productivity. And that includes activities such as canal rehabilitation and automation, replacement of canals with buried water pipelines to reduce seepage and evaporation, on-farm system conversions, better agronomic practices, and development of improved crop varieties that can increase production and quality. In our sector in Southern Alberta, we've seen combined water savings when we institute all of those activities of 48% over about the last 15 years. Those water savings are extremely important for us because they allow our districts to offer more irrigated land to producers, as well as for other uses and users in our area. I think the second key to maximizing potential is really increasing reservoir storage. We need to be able to continue to adapt to changing climate, and that's going to mean that precipitation will change. We will probably see more rain rather than snow. So we need to be able to have those reservoirs to divert when we need to divert, when flows are high or water is coming into the system for use later in the season. And we need to be able also to adapt to floods that we're going to see. And I think reservoirs can play a very key role to doing that, in addition to supporting aquatic ecosystem health as well. I guess sustainably managed, we need to continue to do the best we can to rehabilitate the system to ensure that it is as efficient as possible. That is going to mean that we still have a relatively long ways to go in terms of replacing canals with pipelines. Right now, only about 60% of the infrastructure is in pipelines. There'll always be some canals that will need to be open, but we're on that trajectory to continue to do that. And I think considering on-farm, I think we need to continue to support research that looks at increasing precision irrigation at the field level, matching real-time precipitation and soil moisture requirements into prescriptions that can use the technology that is being developed to really, maximize crop production while not necessarily minimizing water use, but using water as most efficiently that we can, and creating those detailed prescriptions at the field level, and using the technology that we know is in place to best do that.
So Margot, I want to pick up on that last point, because when we think about this focus on growth in irrigation, I'm wondering what what lessons are we learning? Are you learning from what we've seen around the world where, again, if you look at the southern US, there's a lot of focus on how their water use hasn't been sustainable, and agriculture plays a role in that. There's a lot of other things happening at the same time, of course, but can you just speak to, again, what lessons we learn and maybe how we are doing compared to some other irrigation areas?
Sure. I guess I can speak to Southern Alberta best. As I mentioned, irrigation districts as well as the government of Alberta have invested heavily over the last 50 years in improving the conveyance system to make it as efficient as possible. And that's really been positive to the sector. In my neck of the woods, if you look across the border into Montana and you see the areas that are irrigated there, they've done very minimal investment over the last 100 years into that infrastructure. And what it means is that agriculture is not well supported. The infrastructure is aging. There's catastrophic failures. Farmers don't have that water security that they need to grow crops, and particularly high value crops. So you do see, very little investment by value added processing south of the border in Montana when you compare it to Southern Alberta. I'd say if we go a little bit further, there's a lot of eyes on the Colorado River Basin right now. That basin in particular has been over allocated on paper. And in our basin, the South Saskatchewan River Basin here in Southern Alberta, our basin is actually a closed basin, and it has been since 2006. This doesn't mean that there's a scarcity of water or not enough water. And it doesn't mean that the basin is over allocated. Rather, by choosing to close the basin to new water license applications in 2006, the provincial government really made a conscious decision to hold allocation levels at a reasonable level of allocation. So there's still water available for different uses and users, but there are legislative mechanisms in place to allow transfers between existing water licenses. So we are ensuring really that we're not, writing on paper more supply than what's there. And I think that that's really a different path than what's happened down, particularly in the Colorado River. And I think that it has been working well in our basin. There's been a number of transfers that have happened since 2006. So the mechanism is there, and it continues to support increased economic development and municipal growth, as well as agricultural production. I would say that, and maybe these are more lessons that the US could learn from us, but in the case of extreme water supply shortage, we also have mechanisms that can put into place water sharing agreements. That was last implemented in Southern Alberta during the historic 2001-2002 drought. It was led by our irrigation districts, and really what it did is it allowed all signatories to that agreement to reduce their demand and share the water supply that was available. We do operate under a prior allocation system here, so senior licenses have priority over those junior licenses. So when you are in an extreme supply shortage, it's quite important to have a tool like that can allow everyone to come together and kind of share the burden of the low supply that you're experiencing.
Great, thank you. And so we're going to bring our other panelists back into the discussion now, and want to pick up on this theme, I think, around working together. You know, it is interesting where Canada's a large country, small population. We have a large, if you look at our freshwater availability per capita, we've got a relatively large amount, 8 times more than the US. Agriculture itself withdraws a relatively low share of this available water compared to countries like the US or Brazil. But it seems like there are 2 issues at play. One, we take it for granted, but we also then don't maximize its full potential. Nicolas Mesley, I want to start with you in this discussion. Do you think that that's an accurate assessment of where we're at today? Do we take our water for granted, and should we be doing more to leverage this as a resource in Canada?
For sure, Tyler. I'll give you a concrete example. I lived 2 years in Venezuela, and when you were going to fill your car with gasoline, people would put the the gun in the reservoir, and it would spill all over the place. So I said to the guy, I said, look, you are wasting oil. You know, it's he said, it doesn't matter. We have a lot. So I compared this mentality with what we have here in Canada, and this is why I think that in the whole, I would say we will need a change of culture. You can ask a lot of things to farmers, and you know, like they can, like Nicolas and Margot said, there is technology, there all those savings of technology and things like that, all the burden that the investment that they have to do to keep it in business, you cannot do that alone. It has to be side by side with the society. Now, the big challenge is how do you do that? You need some people with I would say conscious, or I say you need a driver somewhere to say, look, we have a lot of water, but. And also, I would go further than that, if you allow me. When you look at, it's a bit of politics, but anyway, when you look at crisis right now, like food crisis, you never hear Mr. Trudeau, Prime Minister Trudeau, like you would hear, for example, the French president or the US president talking about, look, we will do something, we will. So it's sad to see the second largest country of the world, like you said, not much populated, but with a lot of resources, not taking its place. If we have a base, we have 200,000 farmers who are committed, educated, who they have access to finance. They have, we can play a far better and a far, I would say, I wouldn't use aggressive word, but I think Canada needs to take its place, and in term of affirmative, how could I say, be there, look, and this is where we need a driver, but we need a whole reflection. And when you were talking, I take the ball from Nicolas when she said that, yeah, the national water agency, which is just created, what will be the role when you think that each provinces is jealously keep the things for itself? They only ask for money and no, this is where, it's like the health system. Well, the health system, at a point of time, do we want it national or do we want it? So the federal money is investing money, and there should be a direction that we discussed before.
And if I can bring in Usman, I think that direction, again, going back to your comment about that nexus that exists today, that direction needs to reflect this connection, this potential conflict between, again, not just water and agriculture in this case, but water and agriculture and energy and food production. How do you see it? Again, if we were gonna maximize water's potential, maximize this resource for us? How do we think about that in the context of this nexus that exists?
I think we need to be careful about what we mean by maximizing. Are we maximizing economic benefit? That will be dangerous. So Canada have plenty of water, but maybe it has more value where it belongs, in the river, to protect ecosystems. So it's not because we have 8 times per capita more water than anybody, then we can use 8 times more. So we have to be, yes, there are opportunities to make more values, but we tend to forget non-monetary values of water, recreation, cultural values. And we cannot just take all the water and produce, produce goods with it. So we have to be careful. Quantity do not translate into value. Sometimes it's better to leave it where it is.
Well, and it's interesting because I think if you look at Nicola talking about in the context, of water reuse or fit for purpose water, I think that gets at some of that point too, right? That the purpose being beyond just that, beyond more than just economic potential or development, but how do you think about that in the context of, again, these jurisdictional issues that exist, where again it's not just if we think about irrigation in Alberta, that has consequences for Saskatchewan, Manitoba, for the rest of the watershed. Professor Sedu, can you speak to, again, that reflex from a jurisdictional issue and understanding what that means as well?
Yeah, that's a complicated issue which is beyond my expertise, but typically when you have several actors with different interests working on one resources, it's very difficult to bring them all to agree on what's the best course of action. So I think what it takes is dialogue between users, at least understand each point of view. Because a lot of time, a user will only understand his own benefit, but will not understand the impact. So what we have seen in the Niger Basin is, before talking to each other, you can have 2 actors which have very different positions, but when they talk to each other, understand the issue of the other, knowledge is important, then they are more willing to make concession. But before they just, oh, you want to limit my electricity production, I need it. You don't think globally. We need to think globally, but it's not easy because everybody has his own interest. So this is beyond my expertise. It's more in social science, economics, but we need to find a solution.
But to Nicola Crawhall, again, you've worked to kind of at that intersection for your career. My sense is that this is more difficult than it used to be to deal with kind of these different needs, these different demands, these different pressures that exist. How do you see that playing out?
I don't know if it's more difficult. I'll give you the example, of the Walkerton tragedy. There was E. coli in the public water well. 7 people died. 2,000 people became ill. How did we see our way through that? That was an awful situation. What came of that was incredible innovation around mapping water resources, identifying threats or potential risks to drinking water, engaging stakeholders in every single watershed to figure out how to mitigate those risks. Many people came to Ontario in terms of companies wanting to get a piece of the action because there was so much technical information that was needed. I see the opportunity here as significantly bigger than that. Get young people and companies and startups excited about the circular economy. Get them excited about fit for purpose treatment of water. Get people thinking, I want a piece of this action. So I'm very hopeful it's getting it going. It's getting that national conversation. It's defining the opportunity, and it's providing support to Canadian technology entrepreneurs to get behind this. But that means that the agricultural sector, the municipal sector, the oil and gas sector have to be open to using these technologies and helping in fostering this industry that could come out of building resiliency, creating a circular economy.
You know, and that is, you know, Margot talked about the move to some new technology and innovation. And if you look around the world and higher value crops, there really are some amazing advances in how irrigation technology is used, right? That's driving down potential. And maybe Margot, there's a question in the chat around, you know, what are those examples, some of those examples of high value crops? And you talk about going from being able to grow 30 to 60. So if you could maybe just answer that question about what are examples of those crops that our farmers are moving for. But I'm curious as to what opportunity or what action is happening today to drive that growth in technology and innovation. Do you see that leadership happening in Alberta, especially if you look at this potential for irrigation growth?
Yeah, so I'll answer the first question. So right now, you know, some of the highest value crops that are grown in southern Alberta are potatoes, sugar beets, seed canola, alfalfa seed, those sorts of things. We also have a fairly niche sweet corn subsector that's located right around Tabor. You know, we're seeing huge investment in processing facilities. About 6 years ago, Cavendish invested significant money to build a new potato processing plant. Just last week, McCain has similarly announced an expansion of their Coaldale plant. So, you know, those agri-food processors are again locating in southern Alberta and investing their dollars there because of the safe, consistent and high quality product that they can get. The second question in regards to technology, you know, our irrigators over the years have really embraced technology, particularly around on-farm water application systems. You know, about 2005, only about 54% of the irrigated area in our districts was under low pressure drop tube pivot, which has about an 80% water efficiency rate, as compared to the old gravity methods, which only have about a 30% efficiency rate. You know, this year, we're up to about 84% of the irrigated area that is now under low pressure drop tube pivots. So those farmers are making those investments. They are significant financial investments. You know, one quarter section pivot system that covers and irrigates about 155 acres or 60 hectares. All in is at least $400,000. So for them to do that on one parcel is significant. You know, we have irrigators that have, you know, hundreds or thousands of irrigated acres, and the majority of their acreage is being irrigated in that manner. Again, you know, moving forward, I think there's still opportunity for additional conversions to take place, but we will be limited and we will get to maximum. So the next step is really trying to maximize what the demand is from the crop, and looking under the soil and trying to find an efficient and cost-effective way to bring the technology in that you can actually really at the micro level determine how much water each particular grid on the field needs. So there is research going on that, but again, it is going to take a little bit of time because it's about cost-effective solutions. When we talk about sustainability, you know, it's economic sustainability as well. So it can't come at a cost that's too significant for the irrigators. Otherwise, they won't be able to make that business decision to move forward.
I mean, again, I ask this question, we'll go around the panel with this. The cost does come up as kind of a consistent theme, the cost of the management infrastructure, the cost of the impact of flooding or the impact of drought, the cost of that, but also the cost of the resource. So Nicola Mesley touched on this earlier. I think that there's this big question around what role the price on water plays in ensuring the sustainable use of it and protecting the resource. So maybe I'll start, Nicola Crawhall, with you on this. What's your perspective around where water pricing plays it? Maybe are there lessons we learned from what's happening in municipalities where prices have been put in place, and what potential do you think that this has in the agriculture context?
Sure. I mean, I can talk mostly about the municipal sector. There's been a big push for a number of years now for full cost pricing. That is, that the household is charged an amount that will cover the full cost of the capital and operating costs of the municipal water system. Not all municipalities are there yet, but there's been huge progress there. But just recently, since the pandemic and now high inflation, there's a huge focus on affordability. And a lot of municipal councils are asking their utilities to ensure that they have affordable rate structures. I think water is very affordable for households. It's a question of whether you should have a graduated rate structure, where if you consume more water, some municipalities will charge you more. So that gets into industrial and commercial usage, not residential usage. And I think that's appropriate because what if some other countries start charging for water and we don't? What will happen is the water takers will come to Canada and we'll have a disproportionate burden on water taking. So I do think that there is a place for a discussion around charging for water, but certainly not putting the burden on residential usage.
Right. And so, Professor Sedu, when you look around the world and some of the work that you've done, how does pricing water, again, to pay for the infrastructure, but also to pay for the resource, play into the work and how things are changing?
So I think water is so you can look at it as two ways. So it is something which is necessary for life, so it should be affordable, but it's something which costs. So you need to balance these two aspects. And what Nicola was mentioning is having a price structure where even poor people have access to water, but as you increase your consumption, then you start paying higher rates. That might be one option. And it's also, we notice that in some countries, when you provide the infrastructure for free, then it's not being maintained. So it's counterintuitive. When it's totally free, nobody has ownership. And then so you need to charge people enough for them to have ownership, but keep accessibility to water. So not phase out people from access to water. So it's really complicated.
And Margot, maybe just what happens today? So are irrigation users covering the cost of the infrastructure, or are they effectively paying more for the resource they're using?
So it's a little bit, I guess, complicated. Irrigators and other water users that receive water through irrigation infrastructure, irrigation district infrastructure, are charged an annual water rate. Irrigation districts are not in the business of making money. And so that water rate is generally designed to cover the cost of operation and maintenance of the infrastructure, as well as putting some away for future rehabilitation activities and replacement. when we're talking about expansion and development of new irrigation parcels, irrigators are charged what's called a capital asset fee to put the irrigation assessment essentially permanently onto the parcel. We're a little unique in Southern Alberta that the irrigation acres stay with the parcel. They don't move with the landowner. And so essentially it's almost like the irrigator is buying into the infrastructure of that district. That rate varies between districts. Our largest irrigation district, who is undergoing an expansion right now, is currently charging about $29 an acre for annual water rate and about $4,000 an acre capital asset charge for new irrigation acres on new parcels. Other users are also charged conveyance rates and fees. Again, I would say that those generally between districts are designed so that they cover the cost of operation and maintenance in terms of getting that water from the point of delivery to that user. So I think districts feel particularly around municipal conveyance agreements that they have a bit of a social responsibility to keep those conveyance fees, particularly to municipalities, affordable. So that the cost of water to that municipality is not extreme.
Thank you. And we have time for one question that I'd like everyone to answer briefly. You know, we've talked a lot about the need for a dialogue for us to think about water management strategy different. If you can leave our participants with one thought, what's one thing that they should keep in mind as we think about what the future of water management and policy is in Canada? And so Nicola Crawhall, maybe go to you first, and then Osman Sedu second.
Thanks, Tyler. I mean, I think it's be prepared. The world will be a very different place and water availability will be very different 30 years from now. 30 years goes by very quickly. So we need to be prepared for that change, not to wait until we get to a crisis point. We need to be prepared for our own food production and for global food production, our contribution to that. Agricultural production literally in Canada is too important to fail. So let's be informed, be prepared, and see the opportunity here for some technological innovation. Precision ag has already shown how technology can be used now. Precision irrigation. It's an exciting time, I think, to be in farming. So let's bring the minds together. You know, there's a saying of the wisdom is in the room. I think the wisdom is in Canada. We can do it. We just need to set our minds to it.
Thank you. Osman, what should we be thinking about as we set our minds to it?
I think you can take decision if you don't have the right information. So information is key. Monitoring system, doing research and development, and trying to understand the system. It's complex, but the more we understand it, the better decision we can take. And maybe the second take is we need not to be emotional. Sustainability is going to be painful, and they're going to be hard decision to take. And the decision is going to be the global optimum. And a lot of people will not like it, but that's I think that's our only way forward.
Thank you. Margot, one thing we should keep in mind?
Yeah, I think it's important to have dialogue like this panel, as well as dialogue that brings stakeholders and Indigenous First Nations together to talk about the water issues that we are going to be facing in the next 30 years. Nicola mentioned that somewhat. They're hard conversations to have, but they are extremely important. And as Osman inferred earlier, they provide everyone the opportunity to sit down and understand each other's perspective. And then from those conversations, I think then you can get to you know, some potential trade-offs that the particular basin or region that you're in and all of the stakeholders can live with, so that you ensure that you have that water availability in the face of climate change in the future. Our sector is involved in a very large project right now that is modeling future water resources in our basin based on climate change and historical flows, to get together and start to talk about those trade-offs and where the basin wants to go collectively. And I'm very excited to be part of that, because it's basically a consensus based project. So we're very excited to see that one move forward.
Thank you. And Nicola, the last word to you. Oh, sorry, you're muted. You're muted. You have to unmute. No, sorry, you're muted again. I don't know what happened there.
Oh, it doesn't like to be on. Sorry. Anyway, I would summarize it in one word or two. It's just that it's we are all in the same boat. I mean, humanity. So somewhere with all what we have in Canada or for the rest of the world, we need leadership and collaboration. This is how I would end it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Nicola. And thank you to all of our panelists for taking part today on World Water Day. Stay tuned for more information. As has been mentioned before, this is the first in a series of reports that Nicola Mesley will be doing. We look forward to sharing more details with you all soon. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.